Hello and welcome to Leading Interviews. I'm Carol Schwartz, the Chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and today it's my very great pleasure to talk to a great friend and colleague of mine, Paula Dwyer, who's had a fascinating career, starting in finance and working through different types of industries such as infrastructure, mergers and acquisitions, investment banking. She's worked in government, she's worked in private companies, and she's also been the chair of major listed companies. Hi, Paula.
Carol.
Thanks so much for making time to chat to us today. Very excited that you were available. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Paula, the first question I'd like to ask you is actually about your career. What did you study at university? What was your career path? And when did you decide to move into a non-executive director role?
Well, potted history. I studied commerce at Melbourne Uni, and when I was in the commerce faculty, there were 12% female, so it was a very small representation of women. And it was an unconventional path. I had been at a school called Sacre-Cœur, which was a girls' school for the duration of my education. And I was the only one who went into commerce. And, so it was quite a unusual path from the get-go for me. So having done commerce, I then went to Pricewaterhouse and did a chartered accounting program there. And in 1986, left and went to Ord Minnett, which became JP Morgan, and worked really in M&A and advisory work. So, and that was also a very unconventional path. So I had it in my mind that I did want to be involved in finance and, the movement of capital. I don't know why. I used to read the business pages of the newspaper every day when I was at school, and it just captivated me. My father was in business and in listed public companies, and I just had a real interest in it. And I've also very much been very strongly interested in female leadership for the course of my life. And, that I felt that having a commerce foundation would really permit me to have an impact.
So let me ask you about PwC and Ord Minnett. So how many women were part of your cohort at PwC and Ord Minnett?
Well, PwC was, from the graduate intake program, was, there were some great women and people I still call friends who, by and large, perhaps not reached, I think, their professional potential because of various things. But we did have Elizabeth Alexander was the first female partner globally at Pricewaterhouse. And she really did provide a role model for and sort of, I suppose, a pathway to leadership that had not existed in that world beforehand. And, I don't know, for whatever Elizabeth has done, she was really a pioneer. And I was grateful for her being around, because when I think now for young women, there are sort of multiple role models. Elizabeth was really it in terms of professional financial services.
Yeah, and I know that PwC and also all the big four have, very targeted objectives in terms of recruiting women into their graduate programs so that they're at least 50-50. Yeah. And so was there that sort of target in those days?
No, I mean, it was a very masculine environment, and very much it was a, as I said, I think the percentage of women coming out of commerce was much lower. So having a target was just not within the mindset of people. I don't know. I think that the females there were all intent on having a career. Unfortunately, I think in many instances, circumstances militated against them reaching potential. And, it's the classic old things, different pay, promotions, because women probably aren't quite certain about what they should be doing, not quite ready to take it on. I was lucky because one of my leaders was a guy called Mike McGuinness, who was a very enlightened man within the world of Pricewaterhouse. And he I think gave me opportunities to work in unconventional areas. So I was at PW at the time the banking industry was deregulated in the Labor government. And so I made it my thing. I went and did the ASX. There was a course that the stock exchange ran, so I did that. So I became sort of, at my instigation, a banking and finance sort of person. One of the events that stands out from that time for me was when JP Morgan got a banking license in Australia. And I was on the audit, PwC did the audit, and the client asked that I be taken off because I was of my gender. And I was just couldn't believe it. I thought, this was indefensible, offensive on every level, and went to town. But it was the firm's view ultimately that the client was right. And so I had to swallow that. But that pretty much set the course for me departing the world of chartered accounting and going into a more transactional world.
Right, that's so interesting because actually when I became a young lawyer, women in those days were being shunted into either family law or litigation, neither of which interested me. And so, and I would go along to meetings and be expected to take the notes and make the tea and coffee. So my legal career lasted for about 5 minutes.
Go figure.
But I guess you were very courageous to go into an organisation like Ord Minnett because you would have been taking a risk there. You wouldn't have seen too many female role models in Ord Minnett.
No, well, I was, I think, certainly was the first woman in corporate finance at Ords. And, it was the crazy days of the 80s. And there were so many office romances between the directors and secretaries, and there was the kitchen provided full service lunches with grog, and the afternoon would be a bit of a train wreck. And I just made a conscious decision that I would stay the course because it was important to me to demonstrate a different sort of leadership. I've said it before that there was an annual Secretary's Day. My friends and colleagues around the firm used to get together and collect money and give me flowers every Secretary's Day. And, just the tone was always, I was very unusual in the group. That some clients didn't want me to be on their jobs. It was not a fair environment. And ultimately, I left there over a dispute over bonuses on a particular transaction where I was indignant that, I didn't get my share. And they were like, it's sort of one of those awkward situations. And the guy's got the booty. And I said, well, sorry, I'm leaving. So that was good because then at that time, Alan Stockdale and the Kennett government, they were in opposition and they were seeking to develop plans for the privatisation and corporatisation of infrastructure. So I'd worked on a team on the gas task force, which was just a discretionary effort, sort of people around the town. So when I left, Stockdale rang and said, you've got to come and help us with the electricity industry reforms, which I did, and that was a fascinating experience.
It must have been. I mean, did you ever see yourself as working in and for government?
No, not at all. I mean, I was a consultant to government, and there was this discrete unit which was highly professional, doing globally leading work in terms of public infrastructure and assets. And it was really exciting, really well run, and some great friendships were formed at that time in my career. And we were just sort of let loose in a structured way to optimise the outcome for Victoria. And that really set up Victoria's competitiveness and prosperity, which endures today. So it was a really groundbreaking initiative. And whatever one's politics, I think that the reform of the SEC, the gas and fuel, all those old utilities has really underpinned Victoria's performance on the national stage.
Yeah, I agree. So how long did you last in government for, and then where did you go after that?
I was there until 1996, I think, and then I went to South Australia and headed up the whole of the electricity reforms. And that was a project that got effectively hijacked by the politics, so that I bailed out of that. And then at that time, I sort of thought about setting up a funds management business a lot and really wanted to get in to the hedge fund industry. So did that in partnership with a couple of guys. And as it turned out, when I was pregnant with our beautiful son, we decided to call it quits, and I then decided to pursue a career at the urging of one of my partners at Calibre Asset Management. He sort of said, you can't hang up your boots, you've got to keep your oar in and get into the world of non-executive directorships, which I did, and have really had a very great career.
But you would have been very young when you went into non-executive directorships. Did people not encourage you to remain as an executive?
No, I mean, really, it seems so ridiculous, doesn't it? But so I was a fish out of water always, because I was a woman in a very masculine world. And you look now, it's so frustrating. There are so few women involved in the allocation of capital in our society. So you get really good marketing people, really good functional leaders. But if you look at asset management, women actually choosing where the funds are invested in terms of corporate finance, looking at how equity capital is deployed in our society, it is very much led by men. And disappointingly, it's not much different now than it was when I was we sort of finished my executive career. And there was really no place for me, which was the frustrating thing. You know, I was in the generation of Craig Drummond, and I think it just was that there wasn't the support from other women and a network of women to sort of drive you.
Because you talk about Elizabeth Alexander being a great role model when you were at PwC. So my next question was going to be, so who were the great role models that you saw in corporate finance, in, allocation of capital? I guess you've sort of answered that, because you're saying there were no women.
In investment management, no women. It really was. So that was this sort of, at that time, it was the genesis of the industry fund movement. And, the legends of the game like Mavis Robertson and that, you just think about their drive and commitment to get a fair hearing for women in investment management. And Alana was instrumental in that.
Yes.
Alana Rubin was running Australian Retirement Fund. That was huge. And she, and she just held her own and steely voiced, and so I sort of perceive myself as part of that generation. And we didn't have a lot of role models who were educated in the way that we sort of sought to be educated about a broad range of financial stuff.
So interesting, isn't it? Because I remember speaking to a group of women who were in superannuation, women in super, a while ago, and listening to them about the genesis of superannuation, where men weren't taking it seriously as a funds management business. So basically, Mavis and others really got leadership roles, notwithstanding they were always called secretaries. And in one situation that I had, one of the trustees said to me, mate, the reason we call the women in super secretaries is because they do what we tell them to do, which I found incredibly offensive. But the women in super were a very powerful group, and yet once superannuation took off as a very, very dominant and powerful financial business, then men started to take over. Why do you think that happens?
Oh, it's, multifaceted. We live in a very masculine society in Australia. And while we have the aura of fairness, I think at the end of the day, the system militates against female participation in all sorts of ways. And I don't think that there's sufficient conscious calling out of sort of the overriding masculinity. And, of course, people like you and I would say, where are your women? You know, we're not going to deal with you. And it's insufficient for us to be making those calls. And I think systemic change will only come when women have got an equal say in the allocation of capital. And
I agree with you. I mean, because at the end of the day, you know, no matter how much we would like society to be different, actually power sits with money.
You look at you can name on a hand the great female fortunes accumulated in Australian business. It is a frustration to me that there isn't the support and infrastructure to permit women to exercise their creativity and minds doing, you know, being fantastic capitalists. So I want to do that. I'm turning 60 this year, Carol, so fantastic capitalism is what I'm
entering the best decade of your life. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, this concept of women in leadership and women in decision making, because I think that we've been seeing some sort of real regression in this pandemic outbreak, because a lot of the decision making and a lot of the, you know, sort of the leadership groups that we seem to be seeing are groups of men. And whereas, you know, a few months ago it was unacceptable for, you know, a group of men to be seen as leading without women, by, you know, as their co-decision makers. It seems to have regressed really quickly that, yes, we see 5 or 6 men who are making all the decisions about how we're going to live our lives through this pandemic and then what it's going to look like afterwards. Have you noticed that, or is that just me?
No, I have noticed that. I've attended a number of forums, you know, sort of business forums, where it's been a sprinkling of women at best, and these people feel they're making big decisions about the future. I sort of think about it and I think, are they really as impactful at the end of the day as they think they are? I'm not sure. I think the style of sort of, I am the senior corporate leader and therefore I'm entitled to prescribe what should happen is not my style. And I think it's a generational difference maybe. There's a few eminent individuals that, you know, assume that lofty mantle. And I think they've come to the fore throughout this crisis. Not sure in future crises whether that'll be the case.
Yeah, because it's so interesting, isn't it, the articles that we've all been reading on the outcomes of those societies where women have been the decision makers and the leaders, and as compared to where women are not as obvious, for example, the United States and Brazil, where, you know, they're having horrendous outcomes. And yet you look at New Zealand, you look at Germany, you look at Denmark as examples of countries which are women-led, and the outcomes that they've had.
Yeah.
The contrast is just so stark.
Yeah, it has got a layer of compassion in those communities that perhaps isn't inherently masculine. And, yeah. So I have been thinking about it a lot and thinking how I as an individual can be more effective in, you know, participating in that, and without being a hollow voice, you know, just look at me. I think the greatest impact I can have is by being good in my commercial roles and doing my best in that to give me the authority to then contribute in other areas of the national debate.
That's right. And how do you, in your commercial roles, do that? How do you make sure that there are those diverse voices around the table?
Well, for me, I'm lucky in that I can perhaps influence the way teams are put together, and particularly amongst professional service providers, in that I can let it be known that I'm not prepared to deal with all male teams. That so that's professional service firms. I think that in terms of putting boards and that together, it's just a constant grind to get the right attitude to and the right females. It's so, I find it a real frustration that often the females presented are in softer skill sets, etc. People don't feel comfortable with ambitious commercial women, and I think that's got to change. And I encourage young women. I mean, I talk to lots of young women and help them make the transition. And I think that, in part there has been a bit of pushback by women being unprepared for the leadership of being a director, but selecting that as sort of a career choice. I feel that there's got to be more senior, gritty leadership from women who want to take on these roles, not that just want to conform and fit in and work as part of the team. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, but it's sort of interesting. And you talk about, ambitious commercial women and hearing those women's voices. How do you think those women's voices, though, are portrayed in the media? I mean, how accepting is the media of, gritty commercial women?
My experience has been, by and large, negative, and I feel that our media either wants to lifestyle profile female leaders, so it's not about what your view of, gritty commercial issues is. It's a lifestyle profile. How do you manage the juggle? Every prefix that goes with a description of me is busy. She's so busy. She's so, well, I'm not. I manage very well, thank you very much. But, you can't get away from it. Others have, of other perhaps potentially males, are always described as eminent or, illustrious or, I don't know. But I think that the media in Australia treats its female leaders very, very poorly. And by and large, I feel that at your peril, you enter the fray because you will be brought down.
But that goes to your point then, doesn't it, about we're not getting enough women's voices. I mean, women are not stupid. So on the one hand, they're seeing the treatment of other women in the media and thinking, no, thank you. I don't want that for my life. That's not what I want. How are we going to overcome that?
There are exceptions in terms of individual journalists and commentators who have a more mature and nuanced approach to it. And I think if one's, is happy to deal with those, be selective in terms of who you deal with and support those that are more nuanced. I think that that's appropriate, because at the end of the day, it is in everyone's interest to have diverse voices applied to solving the problems of our society, our human condition. And I think that, my husband's a journalist, as you know, Carol, and, I think journalists have got such an important role to play. It just seems so hard to get the message across that the experience of women, particularly in the business media, is so poor.
Yeah, well, and I guess it's only by having equal numbers of women's voices as men's voices that it then becomes so normalised that then women aren't distinguished in the way that they are by the media and aren't written about in a different way.
And I don't know. I mean, I think, editors are well-intentioned. It just seems to be the way Australia works. And you look at the way, that when you go into a meeting, often you're the only female. I mean, you're an outsider from the get-go, and that's pervades all of our lives and decision-making. So it's kind of makes sense that in the media you're an outsider too. And how does that enormous step change occur? I'm not sure. You've been fantastic in your leadership of women, though, and getting women's voices in the media particularly. And I think that, at your urging, a lot of women who've assumed roles of leadership have got involved because of you. So,
well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess I'm just very pushy. Very pushy. Paula, you are involved with so many diverse boards and obviously decision-making in these very interesting times that we're living through. What do you think the outlook is, the economic outlook, for once we come through this pandemic? What are you seeing and hearing, and what are you feeling?
Yeah. Look, I've been thinking about that, and there is no playbook. We don't know where we're headed. We've just got to all lean in to making the changes required for everyone to feel safe about their health firstly, and then to feel productive as, members of society. And working at home, you do get the sense that people aren't going to go back to their life in the city in a hurry. And so how do you get the best out of people in a sustained way working in this sort of remote world? I think the response has been extraordinary. My own experience of companies getting people out of the office, set up at home, people absolutely fully engaged and being productive, it has been extraordinary. And it's just, and I think now the reflection's coming and the fatigue setting in, and so people on the one hand think we need to work to get people back to what they were doing before and how they were doing it. On the other hand, the constraints and risks around health are too great to do that. So we do need to have a sustainable model. And so therefore I think that people will think differently about the role of work in their life, and the role of all the other dimensions of life, and want to spend more time on the other dimensions. And therefore, how does that play out? And I think a lot of people's investment returns are going to go down, obviously, as dividends and yields are, and people talk about negative interest rates overseas, and all of those sorts of things have got pretty profound consequences in terms of just growing capital. But then Australia's in such a great place to live, despite the limitations that we know. It is. I feel so lucky to be in Australia, to have my family in Australia, and I think that we can collectively really build a country that we're proud to be part of. And this is a great time. And so, I want to be involved. I'm sort of looking opportunities to sort of just understand the discourse, think about how I can inject myself into it. And, one voice in the wilderness, but I have got some views on these things and I want to be part of the conversation. So,
a very important voice, I think.
But it is evolving, isn't it? And how do you do it? How are you thinking about?
Well, I think things are going to change quite fundamentally. And I give one example about travelling. How often now are people going to travel to Sydney or interstate for one meeting? I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I think this sort of communication has proven itself to be incredibly effective. One sees the nuances of the body language. I think the technology obviously has been a great enabler. I mean, even if we would have been going through this 5 years ago, I don't think the technology would have been able to cope. And now this is only going to become better and better and more sophisticated and more refined. So I think that there are going to be some fundamental changes in the way business is transacted. I mean, also if you think about, I don't know about you, but I've been attending fascinating webinars overseas, which normally I would not be able to access.
No, I think that's right. And so you're getting a broader sort of perspective, and as people solve this or navigate this world globally, and I think that's great. And so I feel I'm more enlightened about what's happening in the States, the UK, China, Hong Kong, than I've ever been. And just by virtue of these sort of interactions, virtual interactions, which give you access to ideas and views and senses. And
yes, it's great. Paula, at the beginning of this pandemic, when we knew we were going to go into a quasi lockdown, I downloaded about 6 or 7 books onto my Kindle thinking, this is going to be fantastic. I'm just going to be reading the entire time. And, of course, I've read absolutely nothing because I've been too busy on Zoom meetings and also reading everything I can about COVID in the United States. Have you managed to read anything during this pandemic?
Well, like you, I'm a news junkie, so I've just tried to follow everything news-wise. I haven't, I was thinking about, books that I've relied on throughout this pandemic, and the one I keep going back to is Stephanie Alexander's The Cook's Companion.
All right.
And in terms of, it's such a great thing to prepare a meal for the family every day and be using old recipes. And so, I've really enjoyed that aspect of it too, the grounding impact of sitting down, breaking bread together, preparing the meal. So, but, I'm trying to think, I haven't read anything that notable. We've watched all the Netflix, The Stand, the movies.
We'll have to swap notes on that. I think that's a lovely place to end. Thank you so much for being with us today. Great conversation. Thanks, Paula.
Thanks, Carol.